Hello, good evening. Welcome to the second online conversation, discussion, talk around Russian Cosmism in the context of Anton Vidokle's exhibition at Rampa in Porto, Portugal. My name is Miguel Amado. I am the director of SIRIUS Art Center, an organization based in Ireland. And this is a joint initiative between SIRIUS and Rampa. I'm very happy to welcome all of you, particularly two members of the Raqs Media Collective, well-known artistic collective based in New Delhi in India, but exhibiting and organizing exhibitions and working in text and theory and across the globe. And of course, Anton Vidokle, artist, filmmaker, and the founding editor of Efflux Journal. And as well, all of you who are here. So as I said, this is the second online conversation. We had the pleasure of having Marina Simakova last week speaking with us. And we will also have two other guests, Boris Groys next week and Michael Marder after that. When the exhibition opened, Anton's exhibition opened in Portugal, a couple weeks ago, we also had Keti Chukhrov delivering a talk on site, followed by a conversation with Anton. And all of this material is being recorded and then will be made available online through the YouTube channel of both Rampa and SIRIUS, and potentially also in collaboration with other platforms like the Institute of the Cosmos. So I will hand over now to Alexandra, my colleague, who has been organizing this series and the project with me. And after that, we will hand over to Anton, Shuda, and Jabesh.
Thank you, Miguel. So welcome, Jabesh and Shuda and Anton and everyone that is engaging here with us. I'm just going to give the title of what Raqs Media Collective proposed as a contribution to respond to Anton Vidokle's film. And the title is On Why Finalities Do Not Drain Us with Anxiety, an Appreciation and a Friendly Dispute, with a hope for immortality in the works of Anton Vidokle. So, if I'm not wrong. And I think that we can go straight to Raqs Media Collective contribution, and then afterwards we'll have a Q&A with who everyone that is present and would like to engage. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much. To SIRIUS, to Rampa, and of course to Anton for this conversation. It's a wonderful opportunity to reconnect. We're old friends, almost as old as the 20th century now. I mean, going back.
21st century.
Well, yes, 21st century. I think we met at the beginning of the 21st century, Anton and us. And we've been talking, being silent together, thinking and often showing things together across many currents in the world. And I think that it's been a solidarity and a friendship that's quite remarkable. And as we said today, that there is an appreciation and a friendly dispute, because when you make matters as big as life and death, how can one not have a dispute? I mean, if we're not going to dispute questions of life and death, what is a friendship for? If we were in Ireland, we would do this over some Irish whiskey, which would have been appropriate. And I think it would make matters sparkle much more. We're going to try and do it as best as we can in teetotaling circumstances. I want to say this, that Jabesh and I will spar with each other as we always do. We'll have a conversation. And we want, Anton, you to be sparring with us as well, interrupting, derailing us, diverting our thoughts. And in the manner in which, for instance, all the people who talk to Gilgamesh do, I mean, the last film that Anton is working on, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to reveal all the secrets, but Gilgamesh is this figure that we all know. He is a part, and in Anton's case, she is a part, and the mother and grandmother and father of all our stories. She's always going somewhere. Someone always stops her and says, so where are you going? Where have you come from? What are you doing here? And I want Anton to be able to say that to us from time to time. Where are we going? Where have we come from? What are we doing, right? So if I may share my screen. Hang on. Oops. Why can't I see it? Yeah. Okay, on why finalities do not drain us with anxiety. And I think this question of anxieties about finalities grow more present as we grow older. And as friends who've grown older together for a long time, I think we have conversations about finalities. I know that with Anton, we sometimes have these strange conversations about what is happening to our parents. It's not the kind of thing that we would have talked about earlier, but sometimes we now begin to do, because our parents, as they go into twilight, become reminders of what we will ourselves be and what we are triggered by and what we think about a lot of the time. And our hopes, as friends always do, that you will grow and continue to be together. I was looking at all these films yesterday together with, and Jibesh was doing them separately. We were looking at them in our own houses, and it was fascinating to think about ourselves as citizen cosmonauts. So that's why my friend Yuri Gagarin, who is somewhere here even today, here he is, was watching the films with me as the first man who went into space, and went into space with that hope that Fedorov talks about of expanding our consciousness, expanding our horizons, and expanding the possibilities of life. And I like the fact that this little video that I took of myself seeing the film has now frozen at a higher primate and a space and a cosmonaut, because somewhere in the blur between the angel and the ape is the human condition. And I think that all of Anton's films are a reminder to us about what exactly it means to live, to die, and to hope, and to be angry with ourselves about being human. So a couple of things to start with. You saw a lot of dictionaries at the back of the screen before that, and I was looking up lots of words, and here are the words in Russian and in our language, Sanskrit, Hindi.
It's remarkable how similar they are.
Yes.
Because it's almost and smert.
They are the same word.
The same word, yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in gray, you see the Proto-Indo-European words, she or mrt. This is a reconstructed language, and I think it's as fascinating in a sense as cosmism. That cosmism is a projection into the future, the projection into the past of a Proto-Indo-European language that takes everything from Portuguese to Irish to Russian to Gaelic to English to Hindi to Bengali to Urdu. They're all sort of emerged from this mass of speculated words. And it's true, like you said, жизнь, jivan, smrt, mrityu. And I was reminded of this because in Anton's films, you hear these words so often. And in that sonorousness which Russian has, and in Anton's voice, жизнь, смерть. And when I was listening to them, there's also a way in which just the sound of the words is a kind of sensory provocation, I think brings us to a kind of, let's say, to an archaeology of the self. When he's talking about ancestors, through these sounds, we connect in some very strange way that I cannot fully explain or understand to the sounds of the memories of sounds. And it's very interesting that many of the Indo-European languages have often these words for a very core vocabulary, the numbers, parts of the body, life, death, star, what's the word for stars in Russian?
Звезда.
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 Yeah. So for in our languages, stara.
So that's close to Estrella, like
Estrella, right?
Yeah.
So
Звезда
again,
is a little different.
It's a very old word, because the experience of looking up at the sky and looking at these stars and trying to think with them must have been a very primordial experience. And I think that this business of thinking about life, death, mortality, immortality is in that sense a very old thing. And we all know the origin stories of art, where in different mythologies, somebody tries to draw a line, a sketch, a profile of a person before they go away, so that what is left with us is the image, and what is gone is the body. And perhaps, I mean, we could end it all right here by saying, Anton, we have actually already achieved immortality, because that's what art does. It produces memory, and it produces projections for the future. So I don't know, Jibesh, you might want to come in on this. We've often thought about
carry on.
Cave paintings, and how cave paintings from the very beginnings of, from what we can understand as human settlement, are not just messages for their time, but they're messages for the infinite future, just as perhaps the recording of this conversation that we're having is in some ways a message for an infinite future. So art achieves a kind of immortality, I suppose. So do jellyfish. And that's a humbling thought, because if we think of immortality as something that ties us to the divine, we should also think about the fact that it binds us to some of the simplest organisms that there are. And jellyfish are, pretty simple. So here is Turritopsis dohrnii, a very favorite jellyfish of mine, which reverses its life cycle. It can go back to being a bud all the time, so that whenever you see a Turritopsis dohrnii, you're never quite certain, is it on its way from birth, or is it on its way back to birth, right? So it doesn't seem to satisfy the metabolic requirements of conception, birth, growth, senescence, and death. It seems to be able to switch back and forth between different states. And they do not reproduce sexually, because, as I think in one of the films that comes about this, they're not really interested in the expenditure of energy that is sexuality or sexual reproduction. They just clone themselves. So whenever you come across a Turritopsis dohrnii, and they're pretty common, they're not uncommon creatures, you could be seeing something that has, in fact, you are seeing something that is the first Turritopsis dohrnii, and it is still going on. So every Turritopsis dohrnii jellyfish is an instance of its own versions, and versions replicated in a sense through immortality. So until such time, the Turritopsis dohrnii can feed in the world, and it feeds not very differently from this, from the suggestion of autotrophis, because it has very little in the food chain that it needs. So it doesn't need to eat too many other creatures who eat too many other creatures. It subsists on what's called aqueous snow, which is the sediments that fall in the ocean and skims their waves. So it's not that removed from sunlight. And I think these creatures, jellyfish, fungi, which we are never certain about, are they fish or fowl? Are they plant or animal? Because they're not plants and they're not animals. And the way they reproduce and propagate themselves again suggests strategies completely different from the ways that we are accustomed to. And their lifespans are also configured differently. They don't necessarily die, they transpose themselves. So artists, jellyfish, and that leads us to, we wanted to spend some time sharing with you 3 very brief clips from a film of ours called Provisions for Everyday, which perhaps Provisions for Everybody, yes. My mind is scattering because it's late. which perhaps can pose some questions, and I would like Anton to think of them as questions to his cosmic pentagram. Sorry.
Should I remove the arrow?
There is no sound.
There
There
is
is sound.
sound. It's very faint.
There is sound.
It
Did you
doesn't
hear
come
the
through.
sound?
No.
No, we can't hear. You have not activated the sound. Or
But it's, yeah, it's not critical, but I don't know how quite to do it now.
okay.
This is from Buddha.
No, this is from Raqs.
This-
So, like I said, three very brief flashes from a much longer film, but perhaps three questions. The Buddha's fire sermon always says, everything is burning. Everything is burning all the time. And we have to understand that the historical figure of the Buddha, whoever he was, his provocation to go and start looking for answers to his questions came from a night when he went out on a ride where he saw four things: a very poor man or a poor person, a sick person, an unhappy person, and death. And the thing that he couldn't understand, because it never had occurred to him, nobody had told him that people die. So for the first part of his life, he was a cosmist. I mean, he didn't know that there was death. He was beyond cosmism. And then he gets a shock and is confronted with the fact of a dead person. And he asks his charioteer, what does this mean? And he says, well, this is a person who now no longer lives. So he has become a kind of matter only, and consciousness has left him. And And I think everything that what the Buddha does is an attempt to try and answer this question of why does sentience disappear? And he refuses the answers that a lot of other philosophies produce, which is there is an afterlife, there is heaven and hell. He says none of this matters. There's no God, no afterlife, nothing else happens. It's all here, it's all now. Sometimes it keeps repeating because there is unfinished business. And that's, I think, what the question is, that eternity is an eternity. If there is an eternity, it's an eternity of unfinished business. And if we look at it in terms of a calculation of what happens between matter and energy, we realize that this unfinished business carries on. It takes 2 million years for a tree to grow, and in seconds, the fuel that is produced from the carbon deposit at the bottom of the tree gets consumed. We did a calculation for this film about the relationship between coal and energy, and it's a very similar thing. That these 6,600 gigajoules required to maintain the basic metabolic rate of 750,000 human beings. Now there are 7 billion people. You can do a back calculation, and 750,000 human beings metabolic rate is what one miner can make in 1 year in terms of energy. So the history of the world can be written as offerings to everything that is burning through coal, sugar, oil, indigo, opium, tea, coffee, grain, meat. And in our work, we're always trying to think about what is that arithmetic between what is offered and what is taken and what is received and what is thrown away as waste. The very next day, you travel the road to non-existence. This is a fragment from an emperor's diary noting. And I'm deliberately placing it after this meditation that the Buddha offers. This is the Emperor Jahangir, Mughal emperor, conqueror of the world. It's in his name. And he commissions this drawing called Dying Inayat Khan, which is, he, again, like the Buddha, doesn't understand what death is. I would venture to say, like Anton, doesn't want to face, doesn't want to look death in the eye, wants to look beyond, beside, and above and below it, not in the eye. The Emperor Jahangir is confronted with the possibility of mortality, and it strikes him so profoundly that, like Anton, he commissions a series of studies. And he makes this remarkable drawing. One version of this painting is actually in Dublin, in the Chester Beatty Library. I've seen it there many years ago, and it's incredibly beautiful. And it's just called Inayat Khan Dying. Inayat Khan is this opium addict who is reputed to be dying, and the emperor, because he's interested in natural history studies, he gets paintings made of zebras and turkeys and elephants. He wants to see what it looks like to see a man dying. Before that, he's seen people dead because he goes to war and he gets people's heads cut off, but he's never seen death as a natural phenomenon. So dying, this infusion of, let's say, a certain substantial or an insubstantiation of the body, is what began to strike us as being very curious. And we did a series of, again, reflections on dying, coloring with dying. So Dying Inayat Khan, where again this thing becomes a drawing. Anton, I just compared you to a Mughal emperor. I hope that's all right.
I noticed. I was a little bit shocked.
But I mean, it's at that grand scale that one can always begin to ask this question about why die? Why not die, right? So when the emperor is confronted with death, he wants to study it. He wants to observe it.
शुद्ध आगे जाओ। मतलब नेक्स्ट राउंड में चले। नेक्स्ट स्लाइड में चला जाए, ठीक है?
Yeah, and just the next slide is also a kind of, it's a little sketch of what happens when color infuses. And I think it's interesting to note the fact that the death itself is a coloration process. Things change color, you know. You become purple and red and blue and black, and decomposition itself becomes a picture. I was keen to try and connect with when in the Japanese film, Anton, with these. I mean, I just thought that occurred in my mind that there are these incredible studies of decomposing human bodies that are part of the Japanese miniature painting tradition, because they're part again of this Buddhist practice of you must meditate on the decomposition of the flesh as a way to get away from the supposed, let's say, arrogance that your flesh will stay firm all the time. And that's an important learning mechanism to try and understand the limits of existence. Again, bones of different kinds. This is a picture that we've been fascinated with for a very long time. It's in which death begins to play a kind of part as an actor. It's taken by a Maltese photographer who came there in 1857, and he reconstructed this image in the aftermath of a war. So there are skeletal remains that you might be able to observe at the bottom of the photograph, which becomes a kind of excuse for us to do a theatrical performance. But what happens is that we analyze the bones and we try and ask what happens if the bones could talk, right? And if the bones were to talk, they would say, if each of the 206 bones of the adult human body could speak, they would all sing the body's praises. Ossuaries would be operas. The sternum or the breastbone would testify to its owner's pride. The ribs would act as a sentimental chorus, singing an elegy to the fluttering heartbird. The fibula, tibia, and femur would drum up anthems to strengthen vigor. Tarsals and metatarsals, carpals and metacarpals, radius and ulna would praise poise and dexterity. The coccyx would hit a bass complaining note. The frontal bone of the cranium would worry. Bones of every function and description would whisper, scream, speak in tongues and measured tones, laugh, cry, sing in tune, off key and off kilter. Only the lonesome hyoid, the unarticulated bone of the tongue, might choose silence and jest at the excess of cadaverous cacophony. The hyoid would hold its tongue, knowing that every life is deserving of only as much silence or noise as every other life. So here's a counterpoint to Fedorov's statement that the only way we can practice social equality is through immortality. If all souls become eternal and immortal, then there is a chance for equality to be understood. But as here, our bones in this photograph are beginning to say that it's actually when we are all reduced to bones and ashes, that's the real sort of foundation for the equality of the human condition. The hyoid bone, the bone at the base of the tongue, whether it's of the Emperor Jahangir or the morphine addict whose painting he got painted, or me or you, more or less do the same things, right? And at that level, there is I hesitate to say, but could we say a communism of death? Would then death be a welcome portal into a way of thinking about life retrospectively that allows us to think about equalities of different kinds? I don't know. Jibesh is looking very skeptical right now, so I want him to dispute this assertion.
Carry on.
I'm coming more or less towards the end of what we're going to say. So here's a remarkable painting. Again, a gift for Anton. It's called A Funeral Procession. And it's from 1915. It's a painting by an Indian painter from Bengal called Gaganendranath Tagore. And it's at the Victoria and Albert Museum. But what is remarkable is that it's actually a parable or something of human life. So you see the chimneys and the industrial landscape in the detail. And you see what seems to be people coming out of this great factory. You'll see it in a minute here, dancing and participating in a procession where they're carrying a dead body on its way to cremation. So I was sort of reminded a little bit of the processional scenes that often punctuate many of these films that we have seen over the past few days, the films in Japan, the films in Russia. There are people arrayed in all sorts of arrangements. They stand together, they stand apart, they gather, they move, they walk towards us, they walk away from us. And in that movement, there seems to be something being said about the movement between life, death, life, and the eternal recall between these things. But here again, what we see is a certain, I don't know, a certain comfort, also a certain joy, because you can see some of these people are actually dancing, which is what often happens in many funeral contexts, that death is not an occasion then for sorrow, but it's an occasion for the celebration of a life. You can see that the dead body is being carried in gorgeous, fiery kind of crimson in a sense, and that is an indication of a life well lived. Those of you who are in Ireland know that the great tradition of the wake, where people sit and drink with the body and in companionship with the body and with each other. And I think that these are all moments of the elongation of time. They are dilations of lived experience and temporality, which insert, like I said, what art does, they insert the shadow of immortality into mortal existence. We come more or less to the end of our contribution right now, and I want to think about another picture of death. This is a picture of a handprint, taken again in 1858 in colonial India. It indicates work done. It's a kind of signature statement, and it becomes, when it transposes itself to the laboratory of a eugenicist called Francis Galton, it starts a whole process by which fingerprinting is invented between Calcutta and London. The handprint then becomes the marker of the stability of identity. And it's the it's the ancestor, if you like, of the biometric mechanisms that that are now a part of all our lives as we move between places. India has the largest biometric exercise. It's called the Unique Identification Database, which plots fingerprints across 1 billion plus people. One of the things that happens, my mother has this problem. Her fingerprints no longer match the database, because as people grow older, their fingerprints fade and smoothen. So in a sense, it's a marker of mortality or approaching mortality against the seeming eternity of the database, or the claim that the database is actually a stable indicator of a person's identity through life. And what's most fascinating about hands, and here you will see the hand begin to play its part as a creature, like a jellyfish, is that the hand, if you look at our hands, are actually already markers of death, because our hands did not begin this way. Our hands began like that. They began as connected tissue. And the fact that we can separate our fingers is actually an indication that this much space, and this much space, and this much space, and this much space has already died in the womb. This is cell death. This gap between the fingers is a marker of the death of the cells that had actually joined the hand. So that much space between all our fingers has already become our ancestor before we are born. So when we talk about the revivification of ancestors, what are we going to do about our dead selves? Because are they not as much a claimant to the process of life? And I remember Fedorov's beautiful statement that we will animate the plants, we will, do all of that, which means that we have to animate each of these. And then they will, because their sense, this cells, the cell that's over here, the cells that are over here between my fingers have a different sense of who I am and what I am. They're not the same as me, right? And so how am I going to begin to have this conversation with that eternity? If I may propose that that's this kind of loss that Gilgamesh feels for Enkidu, his companion who's dead in the film that is yet to be, in the oldest of stories and the future of Anton's filmic work. There is a loss that we feel. Many of us, I am left-handed, which may mean that I have a twin inside me who's actually right-handed and dead, and he's walking with me, talking with me as I speak to you. Is he my ancestor or my brother? Is he my son or my father? These are all questions that I think we need to think about when we think about death and immortality. Let me end by posing a few riddles, and that's really going to be the end. The stories that we grew up with have an ogre and a king, Vikram and Vetal. And this king has this problem, is that whenever he tries to get away, this ogre jumps on his back and says, if you can't answer my riddle, you're going to have to deal with me all over again. And they keep walking around in a cemetery, in a cremation ground. So perhaps Vetal asks Vikram, when life and death run a race, who wins? Perhaps Vikram answers, life is the counterclockwise motion of clock hands and a clock face that runs clockwise towards death, which is a lot like what this hand is doing, towards infinity. Both life and death must read the numbers, one to run away from and the other run towards the direction of time. Death doesn't yet win, life still doesn't lose, but the referee's finger is always pulling the trigger on the starter gun and the alarm never stops ringing. Perhaps then Vetal says, bravo, wise king, well played, but let's see if you can get to the heart of my next and best riddle, and so on. In other words, mechanisms of life, property of animates, feature the ability to achieve willful or involuntary control over the rate and direction of the release of energy, along with the capacity to divide, which is why so many of the moments in Anton's films are so obsessed with energy. And to create relationships with other animates and inanimates that are a result of that division, or that are present anyway. Life is that which coheres, divides, multiplies, relates, and by doing so flourishes. Human life is that which knows that it does so, and presumably still enjoys doing so. So maybe, unlike the eternal jellyfish, we, in our brief span of time, have the capacity to enjoy the fact that it's going to run out. Seen this way, every human and every living being is a temporary defeat of the second law of thermodynamics, and Anton wants a permanent defeat. We in Raqs are reconciled to a temporary defeat, which would ordinarily have the universe and all matter in it fritter itself away perennially towards chaos as time passes. But the accident or blueprint of life, while it lasts, is a feature of biology outsmarting physics, one infinitesimal life at a time. We are as ephemeral and as strong as a thread in a spider's web, gone in a breath, yet capable of enduring a storm. Everything else is ordinary. Thank you, Anton, for this occasion to have this friendly dispute with you, life and with death. Thanks.
Thank you. where do we go from here?
Thank you so much, Shuda, for such a absolutely mind-blowing presentation with so many references, so poetic at some point and so profound on other points, and very interesting also in connecting with your references and your engagement with not only questions surrounding the topics of Russian Cosmism, but also with, you know, like the connections between Europe and India and the beginning around the language, absolutely incredible. So Anton, maybe do you want to make a first comments and then maybe we open up? How do you want to try that?
We could, yeah, that could be a way to do it. I'm not totally ready yet for substantial comments, but let's say, okay, maybe the first thing is what to do with languages that have nothing to do with Sanskrit. Like, for example, when we were shooting Gilgamesh this summer, you know, I kind of just bumped into the fact that while Kurdish is clearly an Indo-European language that even I can sort of follow, because syntactic structure, grammatical structure is not entirely different from Russian or English or other languages that I know. Actually, Turkish is not, you know,
No.
And it's radically different to the extent that gender is not identified in the subject you're talking about. Things do not have gender, which is incredibly confusing for somebody that grew up with a gendered language. Yeah, but this is only one difference. There is a million differences, and in fact, it's some kind of another universe, of sense of, and at the same time, clearly we can communicate. We still share so many commonalities. It's not something completely incomprehensible, but it is radically different that shares no roots with a kind of linguistic roots that I'm familiar with, at least. And it's not the only one. There are so many. So I think
most of the languages are that, in fact.
In Eurasia, there is like this incredible fascination with the commonalities of Indo-European roots, and we, in Russia, people infer really so much into that, as a kind of a myth of origin, myth of common origin, but it is a myth, just because there is so much that does not conform to a certain linguistic tree, a certain linguistic tradition. And I don't know how much importance to attach to this, because on the one hand, language just shapes so much in terms of, any of us that speaks more than one language understands that it's like the moment you enter another language, you're actually entering an entirely different mentality, an entirely different worldview. It's remarkable, but it's very as seductive as a certain kind of a linguistic analysis seems to be. And by the way, Fedorov was a huge fan of linguistic analysis. He was constantly trying to find some kind of common archaic tradition that would unify a sense of history, that would unify understanding of history and things like that. But actually, in reality, there is probably more difference than there is commonality, and what to do with that. That's sort of one thing that is maybe not the most important thing. The thing that really caught my attention is this sort of socialism of death. Of course, there are so many proverbs all over the world, very much in Europe, death, the great equalizer, in death, the rich and the poor become the same. You cannot take your wealth into your grave or into the other world. You can certainly take it to your grave and it stays there. We find all the time this incredibly lavish burial sites. But is that a model, is that a model to resolve our social conflicts and our social differences, is through this kind of global genocide where we just kill everybody just to make sure that we're all equal? that does not seem to me to be a kind of a productive solution. Yeah. So if that's not the solution, okay, the other one is immortality, and I think I'd rather go in that direction. You know. Yeah. I mean, Jivesh, what do you think?
No, this death business is not my scene, but I like the idea of immortality, the way Fedorov
May I
and
say
yourself.
something? May I ask you a personal question? And I don't know if, please stop me if you don't feel comfortable talking about this.
Yeah.
You have recently been quite ill with COVID, and from what I understand, it was extremely serious. Like basically, of all of us here, maybe you came closest to dying, to death. You know.
Yeah, a little bit. It was towards moving towards that. No, that's why I'm saying like it is not so much that I would have died. It is that I was seeing death quite close of people around me, and it was lucky. I was lucky that I didn't land up in that curve. But what is interesting is that I didn't feel equality in the way, but I did feel equality of distress, which is very different from
equality of what? I didn't
distress. Equality of distress, because the loss of breath, you felt a strange kind of equality to everyone. The idea that you are breathing the same air and you are not able to breathe it. So this not able to breathe, something that you are all breathing together, was a feeling that I'm still trying to process, still trying to work out what did it do to my thinking. It definitely calmed me down a lot more. I don't dispute anymore any much. But what it does is that it basically makes you feel mortality very close, and not a distant reality. It just can appear as a shadow. I think Shuddha using the word shadow of immortality in this moment. So it's basically a shadow of mortality is just lingers around. That's something that struck me in a way. So it is going to stay like that for some time. But it does changes the. I saw the films again, at least the first two films, because I wanted to see it, because I now think differently. I think about how I see bodies. And I like the one idea in it, which I think we can develop a little bit. I would like you to know more. Is this idea of the diving to the self, which is there. I even wrote it down, which is this. To reach the cosmos, one has to dive to immerse yourself into the ocean of the self. Now, this is a very beautiful formulation, actually. It is there in I think the second one or the first one?
In the first one.
In the first film, yeah. So you dive into, it's a kind of a dive into the cosmos, and basically, and then you immerse into the ocean of the self. Now, ocean, cosmos, self in two lines comes. And I think mortality and immortality is in this space, the imagination. What I like about immortality is that it allows you to this thinking to flourish in one's mind, where you relate the ocean, the cosmos, and the self in this kind of diving. It's very interesting to dive in your own self in a way that you're reaching to not to the chaos of the cosmos. It's very clear. It's not a chaos. It's a cosmos. Means it's some degree of where you can see something of your own self. So in that, this part of your exploration in the film, I think is through what I sensed is through landscapes, where because you don't really invest yourself seeing, trying to image cosmos. You basically want to see landscape in a way that allows you that dive. So, and I think what is interesting thing about mortality is this finitude, seeing finitude, but seeing it not as finitude. the way you see landscape has that doubling, where you see a finitude of horizon, you see the camera captures a very finite space, but and then there is this sense that one can actually captured something beyond that finitude in that image. And I was thinking why, because when you had shown me the second last film, where it becomes very ritualistic, I was wondering where did ritual come from. And today actually it's a very interesting way I understood it's that it is through the ritual the landscape kind of exceeds itself, moves away, and it is through the ritual you want to you kind of approach again this question of seeing finitude but actually experiencing something beyond the finitude. And this movement is what I found quite fascinating, and probably this movement is something one suddenly come close to a death or near death kind of environment, not so much to yourself, but you're kind of mobile, you kind of feel that it is all around you and you can land into that space. So I was just wondering whether you move to the ritual, fully a ritualistic domain, almost to starting from landscape and a kind of a post-industrial landscape, to a slowly more architectural landscape, and then to a ritualistic landscape. There's a kind of a journey in these 4 or 5 films, and I was just wondering that whether you're tussling with this.
The ritual, yeah, that's in the Autotrophia, the film I shot in Italy in a small village, yeah. And sure, I mean, with the landscape, part of it was just accidental in the first film that we started shooting a lot of landscape because, we didn't know what else to film. There are no cosmists still alive. There is not like the object of cosmism. It's all about this kind of invisible energy. I think it has a little bit to do with a lot of it as a product of sort of 19th century, but 19th century is also when, for example, X-ray is discovered by Marie Curie, and suddenly there is this kind of scientific realization that there are forces and energies in this world that we do not see, that we do not perceive, that are so powerful they can kill us, and that reality is shaped very much by this kind of invisible forces, which is something that religion has always talked about, of course, all sorts of religions, but I think that the kind of scientific discovery of this kind of subtler energies or invisible energies really transformed the imaginary and affected also artists very much. Like, for example, I never realized that with like a lot of early abstraction, if you think about, I don't know, somebody like Sonia Delanoux, for example, yeah, that these are not decorative panels, they're very beautiful and very colorful, but what these artists are trying to represent is some kind of intersection of force fields that are maybe truer reality than a kind of a mimetic photographic reality reproduced by a realistic painting or a photograph, yeah, that really show like the skeleton of energetics, yeah. And you can even maybe make a claim like that for somebody like Cézanne, even though actually he probably did it more unconsciously, yeah, but there is this kind of a desire among artists to somehow unravel the veil of visual reality of a certain kind of realism, or accepted realism, and to try to depict some kind of, let's say, true reality of much more abstract forces that shape three-dimensional space, that shape our relationship. So but to get back to the landscape, yeah, so a lot of the center of cosmism is really, it exists as a series of texts, as a bunch of poems, as, ideas more than objects, yeah. So when you want to make a film about it, unless you want to make like a kind of a very kind of didactic documentary with talking heads and interviews and, interviewing some philosophers, what do they think about these ideas? There is actually kind of radically nothing to film. So so what I wanted to try instead, because there was no object to represent, there is this kind of an idea like that you see in some, for example, in a Tarkovsky film that's called The Mirror, which is really beautiful. It's this idea of almost like reality as being shown by something like a crystal stopper, like this faceted piece of glass that does not, you don't see anything inside of it, but all of the facets reflect all of its relationship to external reality. So in The Mirror, you never see the person about whom this film is about. You only sort of gradually understand their life or reconstruct their life story through some kind of memories of other people's relationship to this person, So this is kind of how, out of necessity, we had to approach the first film because there was nothing to focus on, So, and also like all of the energy that animates it is this invisible energy, but how can you film radiation if it's invisible, for example? I mean, maybe you can depict it by showing dead plants or dead grass that it kills, or overgrown plants, like you can't represent it directly. You could only somehow show its effect on other things, its traces, the mark that it makes. So and then the other thing is that as I was reading more and more about it, like there are, and these are very simplistic ideas and I don't totally buy them, but there is a kind of this theory that within Russian culture, the fascination with space and cosmos and outer space is in a certain way, let's say, a reflection of the vastness of the country itself, because the distances are just so enormous, that in a way, like maybe coming from this particular psychological geography, it's a little bit easier to form a relationship with the immensity of the universe, because you're actually living in this depopulated, rather unhappy, enormous geography, that traverses 14 different time zones, where sometimes there is so much space between cities that you don't need prisons because there is no escape, because there is so much unpopulated space around them that there is no escape. So it's both like incredibly porous and open to the universe, and at the same time it's intensely claustrophobic, because our bodies are so weak and we need water and food and sustenance and calories and maybe company of other humans, and you're kind of in this very strange place. Of course, I'm not talking about Moscow or St. Petersburg or major populations, but the vastness of the land itself, the thing about the ocean, this is not from Fedorov. I believe I came up with these lines, but it's really something like in a bit of a trance. There is a thing about the Russian word for spacesuit. It's skaphandr, which is, I believe, probably something from Greek, from ancient Greek, but it's also the word for the diving suit. So it was always kind of a very strange thing for me that what cosmonauts wear to go to outer space is the same thing that the divers wear to go into the ocean. And just another point of connection was, if in SIRIUS, for example, the actual space voyage, the actual trip to the planet of SIRIUS, actually, if you look closely, he's not going anywhere. It's almost like he's going inside of himself. It's almost like a mental trip, rather than, there is no depiction of like, for example, if you compare it to Stanley Kubrick and Odyssey 2001, or like the depiction of this enormous spaceships with like this very simple camera trick in a studio with a model of the camera moving incredibly, excruciatingly slow next to some object, which makes it look enormous because it's slow. This is not shown. What is shown is some kind of a change in the psychological space between being in the terrestrial environment and then kind of transforming yourself to enter extraterrestrial environment of another planet that happens to be a sentient planet. Yeah, it's much more of a psychological trip than it is like a kind of a physical travel. Yeah, and this is something, if you read like Gagarin's, the little that he wrote, or his comments or observations, a lot of like early cosmonauts in the Russian space program speak about their experience or use language which is really heavily spiritual, more than let's say a kind of a positivistic scientific kind of language. Yeah, and they all kind of mention some kind of a either spiritual or metaphysical transformation or experience that space flight is for them. Yeah, and then of course you could also say that, well, you know, we are in space. Just because we're on a planet that moves through space does not in any way, like, we cannot extract ourselves from the cosmos. This landscape is cosmos. You know, my house is in cosmos. We live in cosmos. We are completely cosmic creatures. Yeah, there is no other home. Yeah, we happen to be more comfortable within the oxygen-rich environment of, you know, gravitational field created by a planet. But in reality, this is not the whole thing. The whole thing is, yeah, a much bigger thing, and we're inside of it. We're in the middle of it. We're not outside of it. We don't have anywhere to go because we are already there. We're here, which brings us to all of these rituals, which, yeah, I never was interested in it, and then suddenly, when, yeah, I kind of came across this really beautiful, very ancient pagan ritual in Italy, which is actually probably Celtic in origin. I think it probably has some kind of Druid roots from the British Isle. It's I did a bit of research into it, although not much is written about it, but it seems to be what it is. It's a kind of a pagan festival of King Oak and King Holly. These are two different trees. Oak is supposed to be the king of the summer. It's like the tree that dominates the summer because of its enormous strength, its enormous size. And then a holly tree in the British Isles is an evergreen. It's not an evergreen in Italy, which is interesting that they still use these two specific trees. But holly tree represents, like, holly is the king of winter because it's evergreen, because it doesn't shed leaves, and it's kind of like this, okay, immortal tree. And by connecting the two trees, you're actually connecting the solar cycle. You're bringing the summer and the winter together, and you're completing basically a cosmological turn, orbiting of our planet around the sun. This is what is being celebrated. And then, of course, I had a kind of a little disagreement or a debate with actually a very smart young guy from Siberia during one of this kind of Zoom panels with my colleagues from Russia, where I kind of blurted out that, well, maybe all rituals are inherently cosmic or cosmological, whichever way you want to put it, because somehow just the repetition is always calendaric, and time is essentially about this rotation, this movement, this orbiting, the repetition, you know, the change of seasons, the return of the spring, the summer, you know, which is really is about movement of our planet in space, its proximity to a star that we live next to. And he totally disagreed. He said, but what about people in Siberia that worship bears, you know, and they every once in a while they decide to, you know, whatever, pay tribute to the bear. There is nothing cosmological about it. And look, he has a point. I don't know, you know. But of course, the bear also lives in the cosmos. So you could also say that, you know. Yeah. And then actually, once I started working on Gilgamesh film and the script, I think actually it made me think that maybe I was kind of more or less right with my sort of insight or whatever it is, intuitive thinking about rituals and cosmology and cosmos, that at least with Sumerians, and a lot of people have written that a lot of, you know, earliest rituals, at least in the European context, they're rooted in Sumerian religions and Sumerian cosmology, and then kind of radiated from there. And of course, maybe somebody from India would completely disagree, because I know that there is a civilization just as ancient in, I forget the name of the valley, that's actually happened simultaneously with Sumer, that also produced a very, very advanced urban civilization, probably with religions and rituals and all of that. But a lot of, let's say, Eurasian mysticism is heavily influenced by Sumerian ancient worldviews, yeah, and their rituals and their religion is incredibly tied to observation of the cosmos, observation of stars and planets, and really rather advanced astronomy. And of course, this is the birth of astrology as well at the same time, because the idea is basically what I'm saying, that you cannot separate your life on this planet from the immense influence that cosmos wields over everything, just because it's so enormous and we're inside of it, yeah? So they kind of assume that there is a connection between events that happen in the cosmos and events in our individual lives or collective lives or social lives, in nature and so forth. And one could actually establish this relationship and understand them, read them like a book, if we were only a little bit smarter and were able to interpret the sky a little bit better. Because for them, it seems the sky was like a bulletin board that gods were using to communicate with us, but we're so stupid. It's so difficult for us to read the language of the stars, yeah? And they got very, very obsessed with it, you know, that at a certain point, from what I've read, at least the aristocratic class would not make any decisions without consulting an astrologer. So your choice of the jacket that you would wear to go somewhere needed to be sort of coordinated or decided based on current situation and in the sky, yeah, in the star constellation. But so yeah, anyway, I gave you an incredibly long answer, probably way too long.
Indian politicians don't make any move without the consultation of the stars. So yeah, they have their personal astrologers, and they don't make any
they
move.
Do.
They do. Yeah, they don't go sometimes to take oath of office, thinking that if the time is not auspicious, they delay it. So they have their personal consultants. They have personal astrologer consultants. Very powerful people who don't just do astrology, but they also connect various different people. They're very influential people. So they give a cosmological auspicious or a non-auspicious time. Even in minutes, it can be a lot of passage of time. So it is not a static time. It's a lot of continuously there are passages, and you get a auspicious passage and you get a not so auspicious passage. So and you have you can be customized personally for you, depending on your date of time and date and everything around you and things like that. So it is a very living tradition. It's a living form.
Yeah, it's a tradition that has been much abused over the millennia. Yeah,
it survived by abuse. I think there are certain traditions which survives by abuse. One should not. They have survived because it was very beautifully abused. So it could survive. It could survive on various ways.
Sorry. Hello.
You got frozen.
It's a little bit frozen.
1 minute.
It unfroze. Yeah, sort of.
The stars were not being kind.
No, they're protesting. They don't like what we're saying about them. Yeah.
Hello.
Yes, I can hear you.
My internet connection sometimes did limp. So I'm just saying that they survived because of the abuse, because it could rule a certain way in which the world could be interpreted continuously, favorably or not so favorably. So that's the power. That's where it no longer remains a certain cosmism. I think there is a certain egalitarian spirit in cosmism, that you can all reach a certain degree of certain dance together with your ancestor, with everyone, with your there's a great sequence in your film where there is this animals who can just be resurrected back into life, but it's like it doesn't have that this form of cosmology, which is astrology, which has a very different form. It has more to do with gains and losses, which is a very different calculus than what cosmism, which is early 20th century kind of transformation. It was kind of a transformation of our relationship to the cosmos, asking the question again, what is the cosmos? I think the important part of your work and the important part of this tradition is, and I think that is to celebrate it, Shuddha went into a kind of a nihilist absurdity, which was fine to kind of make it completely inoperative, stasis. But the interesting thing is that you conjure the early 20th century's ability to rethink the relationship with very fundamental everyday occurrences, life, death, sky, like it could, this force by which one could conjure. And I think one of the important things of today is that we are returned to a point where we need to conjure back for ourselves return of the cosmos in our life. And I think that is one of the biggest challenge probably of 21st century would be, how do you return cosmos? Fedorov and the films that you construct, you don't return it through science. You don't return it through a more abstract knowledge that I will have of the world and it will come. We can see a rotting horse and we can think of Lenin, Lenin's body story. So the materiality of decomposition and landscape and kind of abstractions of power of electricity can come together to conjure for us a different image of the cosmos. That, I think, is the power of this set of, that's why I was telling Shuddha that Anton has not made a film, he's made a genre. The only thing with a genre is that he has done all the films himself. It is a genre, it's not a film, it's not a set of films. Because why it is a genre is because it is written, is like one after one, it's kind of set of things it's written to elucidate a cosmology into the world with a certain force and purpose and a certain persuasion. And that genre is now picking up various different illuminations from various different part of the world. In Japan, it can find the beautiful chopstick taking of the bones out of a cremation. It made chopstick do other work. It was a kind of a very beautiful act.
But it's a real thing.
I know.
Yeah,
I know it's a real thing. I'm just saying to bring it in the dialogue of cosmism, to bring that simple act, which is part of probably a daily ritual of death, into this rethinking the cosmos is, I think, this genre's achievement, that it can travel in the world and start looking at things and then bringing it back into a certain realign us to the cosmos, by making it also inoperative, because I have to now think of death not as having lost this opportunity of travel, but also maybe an entry into another how do I say it? Like we come from a society with reincarnation. So it is death, and being born again is not really a problem, or being immortal is not really a problem. What is the interesting thing in this Fedorov and your reading of Fedorov and this genre is that it looks like their ancestors in wait or future, or people won't abandon me or abandon each other. So it is a kind of an anti-abandonment idea of life. So I think one of the fear of 20th century was being abandoned. And if you look at 20th century literature, poetry, horrors, is basically being abandoned.
Being abandoned by God, because God is
by
dead.
God, by state, by families, by known ones, the loved ones. But the third figure is always, the God and the state is always there. But it's like, it's a general feeling of being abandoned. So that feeling, I think this immortality captures that feeling in the inverse. It says that, no, nobody will be abandoned. There is a very interesting leader here who died, the Dalit political leader, Khansi Ram. He died. He is a very influential kind of maverick political leader. For 20-30 years, he kind of had a very big presence in North India, and his shadow now is quite big. Because he came from Dalit, which is a lower caste, in the caste hierarchy, lower caste, of people who were forced to do menial work or being forced to be outside with a lot of prohibition and a lot of pushed out of settlements. He had a similar idea, and I think it comes maybe from some other trajectory, which is, he says, I want to liberate my ancestors. This idea is that my politics is to liberate my ancestors. Now when I read it, I was very taken up, because it's very close to this immortality for all, in a sense that this idea of that I will liberate my ancestor is that I will not abandon them to the way the history has narrated. I will not abandon them to their fate. I will liberate them. Now, this idea is what I really like, this 20th century, early 20th century's ability to conjure this force, this figure, this ability to actually recapture, because it's a common task. And in their first two films, it's a common task to bring immortality to all. It's not a partial task. It's not a task of a chosen few. It is not a task of the Politburo. It is a common task that everyone has to do. So, and in that sense, this liberating the ancestors is also very interesting. It's a common task that he sets up in the political agenda of, and not a political agenda, it's a kind of a philosophical agenda of his politics. So in that sense, I think now in 21st century, looking at this genre, it will be interesting to think, how does it allow us to revisit the very reanimate or re-enchant the cosmos back into our everyday life, back into, not as an astrological power of good and losses and bads and auspicious and inauspicious time, but as a real force of how do you say, as a worlding, it's a force that is not limiting us. So I think that is this genre's challenge. I'm not so sure about the genre's move into ritual, because I come from a highly, I'll give you an example. My father is very old, and with the COVID and everything around him, he gets very delirious about death and friends, but he talks to his friends who are all dead. And he really sits and talks, and he has no problem. He's no dementia, nothing, but he actually talks. And the other day I kept on probing, and then I realized that he wanted me to give some money to a temple to do their last rituals, because they are saying that now three of his friends are not very happy. Now, this idea, so ritual is something that I grown up with. I know, and Shuddha's family would have completely blocked it, that no ritual, and our family would have accepted it in long term. But ritual doesn't solve this problem of finitude and infinite, or life beyond finitude. It just prolongs it, So in that sense, but the way the first few three films outlines it poses a very interesting set of look that finitude there is something beyond finitude in the finitude that you're looking at. That is one thing. And the second, I think there is because actually for everyone, Anton's first run through of the Cosmos series was done in Delhi. when we invited him after he shot his footage, we invited him in
January.
Yeah, early February, I think 4th or 5th February or something, to just share with us the idea of the cosmism and to share with us some of his video. And he had not completed anything, so he gave a lecture performance,
which was immediately following the screening of the Act of Killing.
Act of Killing.
Yeah, because you couldn't
so it was a very
position more extreme.
Yeah. It was very interestingly positioned, where Act of Killing and then Cosmism, Immortality. But there were few people who came who were kind of old style communists. They came to see an archaeology of Soviet land. There were few people who are very respected people in our art world. They came to see an archaeology of a landscape, an archaeology of life as it had unfolded in the 20th century in the land which they had in their imagination cherished. So in that sense, this works have also this archaeology. There is an archaeology of that moment in a little ironic way, and sometimes in a little distant way, but there is an archaeology happening of that landscape beyond the finitude, beyond finitude. There is a kind of how do I say, it's not historical. It is just to see the land in another way rather than how the post-90s saw it. You know, so there is it's to see it not in that optic of grab and grab and sell and crash and destitution and billionaires. And so it is another archaeology, another way of actually refreshing for us a landscape. And this, I think, this is one why I think Shuddha would like the first two a lot. He really liked the first two a lot, because I think it gives that kind of a vision, that archaeology that refreshes you to go back to a certain way of thinking that space again. Because 20th century people like us grew up a lot in dissonance and consonance with this history. So we had lost that landscape in our imagination. So I remember a few people who came only to see that talk. And the first film or second film, you have this glass where it's moving.
Like some images and then the performance.
Yeah, some images, and that was how the landscape was opened back. And here it's an archaeology of a political land, of a political imagination implanted on how to see a landscape. That was kind of opened back. So in that I think this genre is also doing that work, at least for the first three. That work for a generation. I don't know how you have got responses on this or not, but I think there is that work that it is doing. It is returning back certain different way to look at the hurried dismissal of that landscape. So there is that is a kind of a quiet work that these films do. That's not this film, the genre of them do.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm supposed to show them in Moscow at the Tretyakov Gallery next year, which makes me completely terrified, because ultimately I'm showing it to people that actually know the landscape and they know
so they may be coming to it.
That's really scary.
Yeah, but I know in Delhi when it was shown, lot of people had come to kind of breathe easy with that landscape, because it has got kind of hurriedly dismissed in their mind, and they didn't have any way to recover it back in some form within themselves.
But I also had people walk out of the screenings. There is a really interesting guy who is like he was a scientist in the Soviet Union and became typical kind of post-Soviet, millionaire, billionaire, just sort of using whatever scientific methodology he had knowledge of to pursue business, and but he's quite interested in art in a way, and he came to a screening of these films in London, and it was quite difficult to get. It was a small, like, kind of theater, so there were not that many tickets available, and I invited him and he came. And then I just noticed out of the corner of my eye that 10 minutes into the film he left, and then he wrote to me the next morning apologizing profusely. He said he totally freaked out because he actually really hates any memory of the Soviet stuff, and when he saw these images and the whole thing, it just completely freaked him out and he couldn't stay. He had to leave. Yeah.
Wow.
So he had kind of a very kind of personal
Breakdown.
negative reaction to all of that, while somebody in New Delhi could actually find it kind of maybe a little bit more of a positive experience. Yeah. I don't know.
Not positive, it's like they could access something that they were struggling to access again.
Do you mind if I ask a question? So, Anton and Jabesh, I mean, you mentioned something here very interesting to me, which is the fact that when there was this not even a screening of the films, but the talk by Anton in Delhi, and people who people came with the expectation of encountering traces or this archaeology of Soviet life. Okay, and then in Shuda's initial presentation, he speaks about and shows the citizen cosmonaut and the small figure of Gagarin. And I think it's in the first film, Anton, where we have this incredible shots of the facade of the building with the cosmonaut.
With the mosaic, of the cosmonaut.
And so I'm curious about how you dealt or whether or not this was an interesting thing to consider between like what we were discussing around landscape and the fact that you said something about there was nothing to film, so the landscape became our almost like what we couldn't, like this kind of representation of this invisible energy of cosmos, right? But on the other hand, there are, of course, and say, when you were saying like, yeah, I'm going to show the films in Moscow and people are familiar with that territory and how that territory creates imagination. But say for someone like, say from Western Europe, like myself, the encounter with that landscape is of course fascinating, but there's no familiarity necessarily. But on the other hand, the encounter with depictions of what I may believe is representations or traces of the Soviet experience through architecture or through iconography in those films, it's there, and that is also fascinating. So how do you reconcile those ideas about, not necessarily trying to create a documentary about Russian cosmism and through that speak about the memory of Soviet Union or the experience of the revolution or early moments of revolution, and those traces today? I'm not sure if I make myself clear, but for me that's always very ambivalent in the three first films, that encounter with the memory of Soviet, what I believe may be Soviet ethnography, and then what's something that is not there, not necessarily related to that. It's more about other kind of ideas.
Well, I mean, I grew up in that reality. So for me, it's also like a lot of it is like completely entangled just with my childhood. And I was very lucky. I had a really nice childhood. I kind of grew up at the time when the economy still performed. I guess I'm talking about late 60s, early 70s, at least in Moscow. People were not starving. You could buy food in the stores. Everybody had an apartment. You didn't have to buy an apartment. You actually received it from the state. There was a very good educational system. There was really pretty excellent free medical system for everybody. There were a lot of it was actually kind of, people refer to it sometimes as the period of stagnation. An alternative name is the golden period, where a certain surplus has been produced during very brutal periods, which was kind of squandered in the 70s, let's say, in a certain way. And so, I don't have a lot of people really hate the Soviet Union or have tremendously painful memory of it, but this is not my personal experience. Yeah. So, and at the same time, you know, what was maybe really what motivated me to make these films, or one of the things that really fascinated me about Cosmism, is that I didn't know anything about it. This kind of idea of a dual reality, that there is a kind of a reality of my growing up in Russia and everything that I learned. You know, I started my art education at that time and everything, you know. And at the same time, such a gigantically stimulating intellectual layer that was a part of all of that was completely unknown to me. And I only kind of learned about it much later in life. And then it's a kind of the strangeness of the superimposition of something that is completely new, completely unfamiliar, quite paradoxical, and, you know, very powerful in a way, yeah? Overwritten over something that is only too familiar, that is completely intertwined with all of my memories, with all of my maybe most important memories, the shaping memories, you know. And I guess this is kind of like, in a way, endlessly fascinating on a psychological level, which I don't necessarily think that this is something that necessarily would produce an interesting film. You know, you could also make it in a very boring way, I guess, yeah. But the thing, you know, like I'm a little bit careful not to try to exoticize, you know, Soviet Union or Russia or the landscape too much, you know, because there is, like with many other countries and cultures that remain closed for a certain period of time, there is this kind of, well, on the one hand, it's nice that there is a fascination. On the other hand, it's sometimes a little bit annoying. This whole, like, you know, people refer to Russians as enigma inside of a riddle, inside of a blah, blah, blah. So like that Russian psychology is like this completely impenetrable, unknowable, strange thing that you can have absolutely no like entrance to, you know. So I try not, you know, yeah, it's just like something to yeah. I don't know if I'm answering your question, Miguel. I don't know. So what is the question of the question? Maybe just to get me back to.
No, it's okay. I mean, no, it's just because.
Yeah, and the image of the cosmonaut is it's a mosaic on the side of a building. It's actually in Karaganda in Kazakhstan. But you know, there are so many like that. That is a particularly nice one, really monumental. But this kind of there was a cult of astronauts in the 60s. And 70s, and these are very, very common representations. They're disappearing as a lot of buildings are being demolished and or just deteriorating on their own. But it's something that you bump into constantly, you know, because I guess space flight was such an enormous achievement that was immediately used ideologically as some kind of a proof of superiority of Soviet Marxism, of Soviet communism over everything else. So it was immediately kind of turned into propaganda and reproduced a million times. And it's on every, you know, bus stop in the middle of nowhere, you would see like this completely sort of metaphysical image of cosmos or cosmonaut. And this is, it's a kind of a really common representation. I used it only once, you know, and even that I had slight misgivings about, you know, but hey, it's visual pleasure and it's very, very beautiful. So
we used to get Sputnik.
Sputnik, yeah.
Yeah, there was a big, like a lot of good books in childhood were cheap books from Soviet land, which used to be magazine, and Sputnik, and the good mathematics books were all.
We got Indian movies. We got a lot of movies from India.
Yeah, there was this exchange.
When I was growing up.
Yeah, rupee ruble exchange, which was only India, and they have this fixed rupee ruble trading between India, and so there were a lot of goods exchanged. No, I was just saying that it kind of sometimes landscapes get locked away for a generation. They invest so much in it that they can't really visit it again. So, and I think a generation before us was too much invested in from people in the 40s, 50s in India, they invested too much in this idea of the kind of a political theology of Soviet Union and the landscape around it, and so they could never revisit it again after 80s. After Afghanistan, Soviet army entering Afghanistan, it all went very blurry, and that they could never visit it back again properly with any love for Russian cinema, Tarkovsky. These were all kind of proxy ways in which you could rehearse the possibility of that language, of that landscape, or that whole political theology, but you could never visit it. So in that sense, I was saying, they came to see this engagement with Cosmism as a way to maybe recover another entry point into access it again. So that is what I was saying, that there is a kind of a route it opens up to open up a completely different trajectory of a different political theology to it, but they can somewhere bring themselves to it. Otherwise, it's very difficult. Otherwise, extremely difficult. Politically, very difficult. Shuddha has to say. Shuddha is saying. Shuddha, are you saying something? Preparing to say something?
No, I've just been thinking a lot about your conversation, but I mean, I would like to say things, but I'm sure there are other people with questions. I mean, if they're not, then
just very briefly, but just maybe to react a little bit more to your idea of universal genocide as the great equalizer. There is a cosmist that kind of proposes that, a very late cosmist. His name is Ilyenkov. Actually, Keti Chukhrov spoke about him a little bit during the live lecture that we did in Porto with her, and is a really remarkable person. He's kind of one of the very late Soviet Marxist philosophers that still believed very earnestly in kind of the Soviet project of scientific Marxism all the way into, I believe, really early 70s when he killed himself finally. But before he killed himself, he wrote a really interesting treatise. It's not very long. It's about 50 or 60 pages, which is basically kind of a cosmological treatise about the entropy of the universe and like the imperative to actually expedite the death of the universe. Like, it's almost like our obligation is to kill the universe because it's so incredibly sad to live in a dying world that if we could just destroy it a little bit quicker, then the new cycle will start sooner and it will be a much more optimistic, much happier time. So we need to design some kind of absolutely diabolical weapons that will just burn up the entire universe in a cataclysm to end it, and then we start again from scratch, kind of a really strange thing. But then again,
would you like me to respond?
If you want,
yeah, sure. I know this possibility, and I know the people who would like. There is this temptation to accelerate the death of the universe, but actually, my idea is not a advocacy of genocide as the solver of the problems of interpersonal inequality. The question of the quality of death is not vis-a-vis life. It is to insist that no death is more important than any other death. It's an anti-heroic position. It's a position against those who say that some deaths are meaningful and others not so meaningful. Most of our deaths are ordinary, meaningless, and then those who sacrifice themselves to some cause or the other are meaningful deaths. The position that I am trying to argue for is the reverse of that, which is to say that even, Lenin's corpse is just a corpse. However much formaldehyde and antibiotics. One of the people in your film says antibiotics and formaldehyde. That's what.
No, glycerin.
No, it's not antibiotics. It's formaldehyde and
glycerin and formaldehyde.
Glycerin and formaldehyde. That's a formula. Yeah.
that his body is just a body. There's nothing more to it. In fact, the cult of Lenin's death, I think, is precisely one of the problems that I'm really interested in how to address. And it goes back, if I may, to a philological problem. And there's a reason why I am thinking that we need to look at Indo-European roots, not for their possibilities, but actually for their limitations. Exactly what you're saying is that most of the world doesn't operate through the algebra of Indo-European linguistics. And that may be a way forward, because the Indo-European linguistics and grammar is always based on opposites. All our grammatical forms are about binaries: man, woman, death, life, child, adult, earth, space, and so on. Whereas, for instance, if you look at the Sumerian, so we have a paradox here. We have inherited the stories from the Sumerian and Mesopotamian civilizations while disinheriting the grammar. And their grammatical forms are, which are present in Arabic or in Hebrew or in certain of the other Ethiopian languages, actually operate in mechanisms that are not along the binary of Indo-European structures. So there is no binary between death and life.
But I thought Arabic, isn't it an Indo-European language?
Not at all. Arabic is Arabic, Hebrew, and Aramaic and Sumerian are one family of languages. Persian is. Persian is Indo-European. So in the Gilgamesh film, exactly like what you're saying, I could tune out of the subtitles when they were speaking Kurdish.
You can understand.
I can understand Kurdish because it's actually pretty close to the way we speak. It's pretty close in terms of its subject predicate structure, and the vocabulary is very close, right? Yeah. Whereas the moment they speak Turkish, I can't understand anything, right? And Turkish is a Altaic, it's a Siberian language, actually, right? Yeah. So the Russian landscape is fascinating because it is actually one of those, like India, it's where you have a meeting between the Indo-European language families and others. In Europe, you don't really have that, except in Scandinavia. So Russia and India, to a certain extent, are places where the tectonic plates of these language families meet. And the interesting thing is, now, in all the Indo-European myths, there is one problem. Life ends and there is death, and what do we do after that? How do we deal with the fact of death? And the gods have the secret of immortality, and we don't. And usually the secret of immortality is something you have to drink. That's why we have beer and whiskey. And these are cultures that actually.
That's not why we have beer and whiskey.
Immortality. It's a drink.
Beer, whiskey, vodka. These are.
Drink beer and whiskey to have sex.
No.
Why do you have sex?
Immortality.
Why do you have sex? Why do you have sex? I mean, somebody in your film actually says it.
You know, it's fascinating. I found some images of Sumerian relief or like clay representations, because they invented beer actually. Yeah. And it's interesting. They drank it through straw from this clay vessels, but they're very erotic. It's basically a kind of an orgy, and somebody is drinking beer while somebody else is making love to this person. It's not about reproduction. It's clearly pleasure. It's a party. It's a feast, and they're enjoying drinking and eating and having sex. Yeah.
Not very far from where you were shooting the Gilgamesh film, because I recognized some of the ruins. Is a site called Göbekli Tepe, which is where
very close,
in Turkey, where the first beer is probably made. And there's a very interesting hypothesis: is that did agriculture come before beer, or did beer come before agriculture?
Beer came before agriculture.
Beer came before agriculture. So beer is the motivation for agriculture, actually, right? But why drink? Why be intoxicated? Perhaps to momentarily derail the binary between life and death that confronts the human condition all the time. And there is one more thing. You've we talked about liberating the ancestors. Most Indo-European cosmologies actually have it the other way around. You have to liberate yourself from the ancestors. First of all, there are many more of them than there are you, right?
Mhm.
And the second problem is that they don't know that they're dead. This is a real problem. They think they're still going on and they are hungry. So the obligations, the ritual obligations of living people is constantly finding ways to feed these hungry ghosts who are constantly asking for nourishment because they can't eat, they can't get food.
Yeah,
but
underworld is
hungry.
a terrible place. Yeah, they're really hungry. They eat dirt,
Yeah.
they play.
Yeah.
It's horrible. Yeah.
So therefore, I think what is very interesting, and this I'm proposing to you as a distraction, is to think outside the Indo-European split of life and death, to think about life-death as a more of a continuum, of a biological continuum, where, like I said, with the hand is already a sign of death because so much of the hand has died, right? But it is for the hand needed to die, most of that hand needed to die for the fingers to live. And this is because what happens at death? As far as we know, what happens at death is that we have a momentary or a suspension of sentience and consciousness. In fact, the problem is that we don't know what happens when we die because the thing that can know is no longer present. That's the problem, right? But that doesn't mean, like, as somebody says in your films, and it's true, the amount of matter does not decrease. The universe is a constant of matter. So what dies momentarily is a signal, perhaps, or some information, or an encoding of information. And the desire for immortality is not just a desire for the reconstitution of an atomic structure or a molecular structure, but a desire to replay the vinyl record, to hear the music again, right? Is to have the information come back. What if I were to say the information's just passed itself on to some other elemental processes? The information's become a tree, the information's become a river, the information's become wind. And it is living maybe other lives that it has already been living. So what is beautiful for me about the decomposition of flesh is how life begins while death happens. In Gilgamesh, there is a beautiful fragment. Gilgamesh waits for 7 days with Enkidu until the first maggot appears.
Maggot falls out of the nose, yeah.
Nose, right? The maggot falling out of the nose is actually a sign of life, not of death. Because Enkidu may have died, but the maggot is being born. And I'm thinking that because I love you very dearly, right, as a friend. And I want to propose to you, because, I mean, like Jibesh, all of us, we are at that age where those encounters with mortality have a reality. I nearly died 3 years ago, right? And I cannot tell you how happy I felt before and after. Because I just felt...
Not before.
No, not before, but in the hospital.
Yeah, memory loss. After.
Okay, after. But it wasn't, but the after was both an acceptance of new life, but also a certain awareness of the fact that the door that is open might shut, and it can shut any day. So in my home with my mother...
But Anton wants to liberate you after it is shut.
No, but I am already liberated. What I'm telling Anton is that
you don't get it. You're suffering from false consciousness.
We're going to resurrect you so you can work in our cosmic commune.
I am resurrected anyway.
You don't
I mean, look at that beautiful painting that happens over and over again. Who's the one guy who got resurrected? It's Jesus Christ, right? He actually did the cosmist thing, right?
No, actually, Lazarus got resurrected.
Oh, Lazarus got resurrected.
Lazarus.
But Lazarus hadn't really died. He was near death, and he was.
I think it's the other argument. I think Jesus maybe never really died because he was God.
All right.
Yeah? But
Because
Lazarus, I think
Lazarus died. Right. Okay,
Yeah.
Lazarus did it. But what does the man who died and the God who became eternal was the first thing he is heard saying? Because there is a person who recognizes immediately. It's Mary Magdalene. She's on the road. She's looking for him, and she says, "What the fuck? You know, I mean, who the hell are you? Where did you come from?" At first, she doesn't recognize him. What does he say to her? "Don't touch me. Noli me tangere." Right? And that "don't touch me" is, in a sense, also something that the resurrected me is saying to you, Mary Magdalene, Anton Vidokle. Let it be, let it go. We are all eternal now. We are carbon. I mean, the fascinating, we made a film about iron some little while ago, Blood and Iron. And the thing about iron, and this comes back to the late cosmist and his universal annihilation dream, iron comes from dying stars. Iron doesn't come from healthy stars. Iron comes when stars become very dense, when they're about to collapse, then at their core, the density produces iron at an astonishing rate. And then it explodes and it dies. The star dies, and iron gets distributed in the universe. So the iron in us, which is why our blood is red, and iron is the secret both of life as well as death, because it is the boundary that creates the division between a cell and mitochondria. And, you know, why do we have antioxidants? People drink antioxidants in their tea all the time. It's to stop oxidation, which is basically the rusting of the iron in your body. Aging and dying, senescence, is basically oxidation. It's rusting. It's to stop the action of oxygen on iron. But the point is that iron is essential for life and iron is essential for death. And I will always argue that death is necessary for life as we know it. So this iron comes to us from a dying star. And our sun, the source of all life, the reason why apotrophia can happen, the reason why you can fantasize that trees can live for as long as possible, and it's true, trees live much longer than us. Our sun will also die. And when it is going to die, it is going to throw out, it's going to make iron and throw out iron, which is then the possibility of life at another time and in another place. So from my perspective, life and death, iron and carbon, are like the empty spaces in the fingers of the hand. They're that closely entwined. And eternity means an acceptance of the entanglement of life and death, not the overcoming or the sublimation of life or of death through life. But a kind of, I mean, my mother and I talk about death. It's like he's the third lodger in our house every day. In breakfast, when she says, "Oh, do you," because of what Jibesha said, because she's obsessively anti-ritualistic. So therefore, she has a problem, right? Which people with rituals don't have, because they have a script. There's a code. The people who don't have scripts and codes have to figure it out for themselves. So we talk about Mr. Death every day. And he's a friend, he's a lodger. He doesn't even pay the rent. I pay his rent. So Indo-European linguistics, Proto-Indo-European creates the division: death, life, man, woman. You do a sly little trick, which is beautiful, which is you turn Enkidu and Gilgamesh into women. And you say they are women. You don't even just turn them into women and keep quiet about it. You say they are women. But what's fascinating in the original Gilgamesh is Enkidu and Gilgamesh are the only two creatures who are really scared of death. The women in the story are not. What are the women in the story telling Gilgamesh? Here, have some beer. Sit down, have sex with me. Relax. You've seen death in the face. It's horrible, it's terrifying, but beer is better. Right? So
Which
it's
woman,
like,
which woman are you referring to? Siduri?
Siduri,
Yeah, but you know who
Inanna.
Siduri really is. It's like kind of it's Siduri is not a person. It's actually Ishtar in the form
Ishtar, yeah.
of a human, but Ishtar is the goddess of death. So this is the message that death
The
is
goddess
giving
of death
Gilgamesh.
is exactly the
Relax,
person
have some
who will
beer.
say,
It's
have
okay.
some beer.
Don't worry about me. You know, have your life. But
That's the gift.
she is death. Yeah.
But that is the gift that I'm saying death gives us. Which is why every day when we sleep, we die.
Well,
A little bit of us dies.
No, there are amazing dreams. The brain works. There is so much that happens. The
Do you
gods
think it
speak to us
doesn't
in
work
our
when we're
dreams.
dead?
Huh? What?
But that happens when we die as well. Maybe. How do we know? We don't know.
Well,
Because
yeah.
I mean, we've stopped receiving the signal. But that's all.
Yeah,
But
I mean, this is a beautiful territory for speculation because there is absolutely no information we could, hang on to here. So yeah.
So, what does death tell us? You can't know what I am. Relax, have some beer.
Well, it's more complex, because the thing is that the whole epic basically revolves very much around Ishtar in all of her different appearances, because she appears, for example, the prostitute, that civilizes Enkidu, that is also Ishtar. Yeah. So actually, she shows up in many guises, and she completely she shapes the entire story. It's not Gilgamesh that is the protagonist of this. It's not Enkidu. It's actually this constant encounters with Ishtar. She basically convinces Anu to send down the bull of heaven, which results in the death of Enkidu. Enkidu does not have to die. This is a punishment for killing the bull of heaven, but she is the one that basically created the situation. So she's a really incredibly complex character, and of course, not being Sumerians ourselves, and I have a feeling that there are so many layers to this.
Yeah, we don't quite get it.
Seems pretty simple, but the more I kind of started trying to understand it, the more I realized that, my God, it's like an abyss, it's infinite. There is so much.
Yeah, I mean, I know that when Gilgamesh was first read and understood, it created a real scandal in biblical studies, because the flood was suddenly, so people said, so did we steal that story? Because obviously this was much older, and here was the story all over again. They even have Adam.
It's not theft, it's cultural appropriation.
Exactly. All right. Cultural appropriation. But they didn't think of it that way. So they had a moment of great guilt. I mean, West European Christian, not Jewish, because Jewish people never had a problem about this, but Christians had a real problem.
In Babylon, they were the oppressed minority back then. So they basically inherited the cosmology of their masters.
Yeah. The Christians thought that, the Bible we have, was it actually not ours? And this is a real problem. And it's actually also a problem, again, of origin and death. Are we really who we say we are? Are we counterfeit? Are we fake? If we are fake, are we really alive? So this is I think it's what you're touching on is absolutely fascinating, because we don't know all the animals that have existed in the world. We keep finding new stuff, right? And we also have the other problem is that a lot of these animals are also our ancestors. So the search for what is called Luca, the last unified common ancestor, keeps going backwards and backwards, and they keep finding new Lucas again. And there is that strange biological principle called ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which means basically you start as an amoeba, you become a fish, then you become a reptile, then you become an amphibian, then you become a mammal, and then you become a primate, and then you become a human being. And that's what happens in the womb. You start as a kind of as a protozoan, and then there's a fishy part of you that emerges, and so on. So we live our ancestors in our biology in a way. And it's, I mean, because in Raqs we've been reading a lot of structures of the brain, and we made this exhibition recently called The Laughter of Tears. And it's very fascinating to understand that we are the only animals that cry.
Right.
And some other animals laugh a little bit.
Who laughs?
Some of the primates laugh.
Yeah. Interesting.
I mean, people say hyenas laugh, but they have a cry. They're not laughing. But some of the primates laugh. Bonobos and chimpanzees have something close to laughter. So they produce certain sounds when they're tickled or when they find something absurd, which is like what human beings do. But they can't cry. We can cry. So,
and crying is central to the eyes, moistness.
So all animals lubricate the eyes, but this response it happens when people die. Why do we cry when someone dies? No other animal does it. Elephants visit death.
Visit death, yeah.
Elephants
Recognize
probably
and
remember, recognize, and commemorate the dead. But it's very difficult to know whether that's cognition or it's affect. But with us, we know it's cognition and affect. Certain animals will not give up their dead children, their babies, not because they don't know they're dead, but because they think they're still alive and just sleeping. It's not sorrow, it's just persistence. So this question of what it is that the recognition of finality, the recognition of mortality does to us. And that's why I'm saying it's not that death makes us equal. Death makes every death equal, and therefore it completely changes the way we look at life. Then every life becomes unique and its own exemplar. And it's death which is not unique.
But you are still too liberated by Anton. Don't worry.
I'm always willing to be liberated by
not a democracy. Cosmos is not a democracy.
You can't choose. It is somewhere. That's why Shuddha has been telling
I want
you.
to liberate you from the illusion that you think that the sun is eternal when it's not. Because you carry in your body the traces of its ephemerality. The blood, the iron is the trace of the death of a sun. And it is also the hope of future life and the death of our sun.
You know, there is a very interesting mythology of a story in Mahabharata, which is the figure of Karna, who is an illegitimate child. Is illegitimate child of a unwed woman, but born of sun.
This is the son of the sun. Yeah.
So he's the son of the sun. Yeah, and he will die in the battlefield. He's cursed because his chariot would give. He's basically on that which is going to carry him will give away when he needs it most. That's his curse. That's the curse he has to bear. And that curse comes from somewhere else. But the interesting thing is there is this. You should. I'll send you that.
I'd love to read that.
Yeah, there's a very beautiful text of his dialogue with the mother.
But the fascinating thing is to look for a certain relationship to mortality in non-Indo-European languages. They're not so worried.
Problem. It's not that it's not that Turkish people relate to death differently because
they don't.
and it's not like people in, you know, Amazonia. Yeah. So,
No,
so
but
in a way, like, yeah.
The difference is that actually, if you think about a lot of our architecture and our art, it is to deal with the separation between living and dying, right? So I mean, before we had houses, we had graves, for instance. Neanderthals buried, for instance.
Yes.
But there are cultures that do not actually burn or bury, because both burning and burial are ways of disposal, are ways of erasure. So you put it under the ground, you can't see it, or you burn it and it becomes something else altogether, and then you can't see it. There are a lot of cultures that actually, first of all, will do other things like eat the dead.
True.
Right?
Yes. Yes.
Or
let
live with the dead, meaning in the sense that they are not. I mean, we have a fear of death, and we think death is a bad smell, but nothing. We've told ourselves it's a bad smell. But in a lot of cultures, the smell of death is not a bad smell. And peculiarly, that fear or that revulsion against the dead and the dying, and it's a class bias. Why do we, the living, feel so abhorrent about the dead? Why can't we also have a bit of an equality with them?
Well, because it makes the labor of trying to deny your own mortality that much more difficult. So we prefer to put out of our sight.
So maybe we hate the dead because we fear what we will become when we die.
Exactly.
But if we don't fear what we become when we die, then we won't hate the dead. They can be our neighbors.
Then you become Buddha. Don't make Anton.
He started
Buddha
with
will be a very tough reality.
But
if Flux has to run, don't make him into Buddha. Everything is burning. Everything is burning. Let him enjoy his genre.
So,
okay,
guys, I think shall we?
Yeah, it's 1:40.
It's too late in Delhi, right?
Yeah, almost 2 o'clock. That's why.
Maybe I think we could have a second part in another day.
Yeah,
but unless anyone else has an urgent comment or question, or Anthony, you want to make a final comment, or we can leave it for another day. But I have to say that it has been absolutely incredible to listen to you speaking.
Yes.
And the insight and the knowledge and the wisdom, and it's just absolutely incredible. And actually it brings us to a lot of different points and threads that somehow not only the questions around death and different worldviews attached to death and cultures and civilizations, but also what the films that Anton have been making and the work that Raqs has been making, but also the new film that Anton is working on that was also discussed here today. So there's a lot, and I'm very humbled to have had the opportunity to be part of a group of people who brought you together, and of having the opportunity to listen to you. Alexandra, any final word from you?
We were just getting started.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I just want to thank. It was really incredible also. I will try to follow some of the threads that you left us to think about, especially to escape this binary logic of the Indo-European culture and languages, because we are so much ingrained in that. And yes, I think I had this feeling that we could continue, maybe with, in another occasion, with a beer.
With a beer.
Yeah.
Beer. And so thank you so much again to all of you, and all of you who have been with us in the last couple of hours. Thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you next week at 7 p.m. Irish time with Boris Groys and Anton for another.
Again, I think Boris will just do a lecture. I mean, I will be there to listen, but it's not a conversation.
Exactly. And I'm sure it will be as fascinating as today. And I hope to see you then. Okay.
Thank you.
Liebe
Bye
Schule.
bye.